Well, welcome, welcome. I think for one time we have more on this side. Is this the Christian side, or is this the atheist side? Do we have a side here like a husband and wife, a wedding here? Maybe not. Okay, how many people are atheists here? How many people are Christians here? Aha, you see? I could tell by the happy smiles on your face. Just kidding, guys. Just kidding, guys. So I'm going to just review a couple questions that I have that I hope these guys answer in back of me. I feel very uncomfortable at these people looking at my behind, by the way. I've never been this close to people looking at my behind.
Uncomfortable as we are.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of things this evening, and I'm really excited about what is going to happen. And we don't even have a soundman here. I'm going to have to get back and control the mic myself. But a couple questions I have that I hope they touch on. Is there science about who is more likely to be gay or not gay? Will the anti-gay agenda eventually go away, as did the interracial marriage or women's right to vote? Over 80% of those under 30 are pro-gay today. If the trend continues, will this be a non-issue in the future? Will it be like women's rights? Will it be like interracial marriage? What harm is done by gay marriage, if any? And what is the purpose of marriage? Is it to have kids? Well, what about me and my wife? We're not going to have kids. And if I were to marry a man, would that prevent homosexuals from having kids? Do same-sex couples have more homosexual children than heterosexual children? If being homosexual is a choice, why do we see 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds express homosexual tendencies without any type of external influences? If a man named Jesus was alive today, what would he say about homosexuals? Would he love them? Would he condemn them? Would he do both? Interesting. The present Christian viewpoint is traditional marriage between one man and one woman, but in the Bible there is polygamy. So these questions can be answered. Okay, Della. And this is going to be our moderator for today. If you stand up and start yelling, she's going to start throwing stones at you. So watch it, okay? Come on up, Della.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Della Mahone, and I am delighted to be your moderator for the evening. And before we do introduce the debaters, I'd like to give you an overview of how the timing will go. You'll hear from the Christian viewpoint for 10 minutes, and then we'll have the atheist viewpoint 10 to 20 minutes, and then one of the other Christians will speak for 10 minutes, and then you get to ask questions for about 20 to 25 minutes based on how nice you are. And then after that, we'll let the debaters come back again, and we'll do the same format, 10 to 20, and 10. So are you ready to meet your debaters for the evening? Oh, a little more energy for them. Are you ready? There we are. Okay. So first off, we have Heina Dadabhoy. She spent her childhood as a practicing Muslim who never in her right mind would have believed that she would grow up to be an atheist, feminist, secular humanist. She has been an active participant in the atheist organizations and events in and around Orange County since 2007. And she's been on the national stage since 2011. She is currently writing a skeptic's guide to Islam, and she blogs about the heinous dealings on the Free Thought Blogs network. There she is. Give her a round of applause. And she will be slightly outnumbered today by the two gentlemen, as they are both arguing from the Christianity position. And I will introduce, starting from my left here, we have Dr. David Lehman. He has a Bachelor's of Mechanical Engineering from the University of Minnesota, a Master's in Divinity from Grace Seminary, a Doctor of Philosophy degree, from Oxford, and a PhD from Louisiana Baptist University. Now, David lectures on university campuses, churches, conferences, and he likes to speak on creation, cults, and Christian evidences. A round of applause for Dr. David Lehman. And then in the middle here, we have David, so two Davids, David Penrose. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and also a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the Mid-American Nazarene University. He earned his Master's of Arts in Cross-Cultural Counseling in Psychology from Michigan State University. He is the author of a new book to be released soon. The title is The Genius Within: Secrets to Acquiring Vast Knowledge. His area of expertise is in the area of practical theology. Also, David has worked as a behavioral and forensic psychologist doing consulting, and he was recently interviewed for an episode of a criminal investigation series which did air in January 2014, and that was on the Discovery Channel. Now, me being a Baylor graduate and Michigan State beating my alma mater in football, I may cheer for another person tonight. Just kidding. Okay, so with that, Mr. Timer, we will open. Our first speaker will be David Penrose, and he will have 10 minutes. Please welcome David Penrose.
Well, I think it's interesting, the questions that were posed at the beginning. But I'm here to tell you I'm not going to address any of those. I'm going to address what I believe is mistaken as the phenomena of homosexuality. A phenomena is a naturally occurring event or process which can be scientifically measured, observed, replicated, validated. I'm not going to talk about the morality of a behavior. A behavior is any action which I choose to engage in voluntarily for any variety of influential reasons. In the study of any phenomena, it's widely accepted that the statement of inquiry has to be based upon the null hypothesis. In basic language, the null hypothesis asserts that there is no relationship between any measurable variable across distinct and identifiable population samples. The reason that scientists, and I believe the discussion tonight is about good science and bad science. The reason that scientists base research on a null hypothesis is that it is easier and more compelling to fail to prove. For example, if we say that sugar consumption has no influence on blood sugar content, and through random representative sampling and replicable methodology, find that statistically we could not prove no influence, we could reasonably infer that there is an influence because we failed to prove no influence. It is easier to scientifically disprove that something doesn't exist than it is to prove that something does exist. Now, for the historical record, the term homosexuality was never even used in public print until the 19th century. In 1869, 1897, Bankert, Ellis, and Simmons. It was after that date that the desire to better understand the phenomena became a focus of study by psychologists and psychiatrists. The term became of interest to Ellis when the stereotyping and social ostracization of a friend resulted in severe depression, eventually leading to his suicide. So the morality of the behavior is not what I'm compelled to discuss with you tonight. Instead, we are here to discuss the nature of homosexuality. We also may even get an opportunity to explore the most recent sightings and findings in the scientific study of female same-sex behavior since the leading research authority, Dr. Lisa Diamond, 2000, 2008, 2011, 2012, and I recently found one today at 2013, has concluded a model for explaining same-sex attraction varying significantly for female samples versus male samples. And she kind of coined the term gender fluidity. Throughout our debates and dialogues, our friends, the skeptics, agnostics, pessimists, atheists, have all heralded the importance of scientific inquiry. And I'm glad that they have, because this emphasis upon scientific inquiry is a two-edged sword. One foundational element of credible research is an ability to replicate the results across similar samples, but by different researchers. A note of caution: correlation does not necessarily prove a cause-effect. In the year 2015, we must reflect upon a number of general findings that can strongly influence the outcomes of research, like the finding that external dialogue, internal dialogue, and visualization have all been proven to change the physiological processes in the brain and its physical structure using functional MRI data. Keep in mind that the best research, the best science, is conducted by individuals who do not have a bias or prejudice. It is not compelling that researchers who have a strong philosophical opinion would conduct studies resulting in support of their own philosophical bias. It is not compelling that research which has a vested interest in the outcome would find those studies yet fail to be replicated. Therefore, in the 21st century, all research is biased. The answer is not necessarily whether it is biased, but unarguably to what degree it is suspect. This is why unrelated researchers must be able to reach similar conclusions when they run conditions just as were run in the original research. When research fails to be replicable, the original conclusions become suspect. For discussion's sake, I believe the null hypothesis are these. There are no reliable markers which predict the incidence of homosexuality. An individual is not born either homosexual or heterosexual. The brain of a homosexual does not differ structurally from that of a heterosexual. Good research seeks to identify reliable evidence in order to reject the null hypothesis. In addition to philosophical bias, science also must contend with the pressure of social and political forces, those who are funding the research, in order to provide a confirmation of what society and policymakers want to hear. Santover, 1996. By the way, this paper is going to be made available for you, as well as the bibliographic information. It would be more than naive to refuse and acknowledge that R1 institutions, depending upon governmental funding to keep their doors open, will affirm findings that are consistent with the political agendas of the day. Now that we have that out of the way, consider the three schools of thought when it comes to understanding and explaining sexual preference and sexual orientation. This information is not mine, but the synthesis of the most recent juried research that I could find. Clark et al., Durand and Barlow, 2013. There is the essentialist, those who say the sexual orientation of either the male or female is predetermined by biological factors which are identifiable. There are social constructionists. Everyone is born without a predisposition toward any particular sexual preference. and the socialization school. Every individual has the ability to choose how and with whom they will express themselves sexually. Keep in mind the true stakeholders in this debate are those who choose to express themselves in a non-heterosexual, non-traditional way. If repeated studies were to confirm the genetic marker for homosexuality, like XQ28 from Bailey, Dune, and Martin, 2000, then there could be a test developed to determine if a fetus had that genetic anomaly. A choice could then be made to abort that unborn child. However, blocking that trend and making it illegal to abort a fetus based upon a genetic characteristic does not really support the LGBTQ political activist agenda. They would have to support the belief that a fetus is a human life, and conducting an abortion for that reason is equivalent to murder. If you don't think this is a real probability, then consider the company 23andme.com, which currently offers DNA scanning using a saliva sample to create a DNA profile, all for the low cost of $99. Say goodbye to Roe v. Wade.
That are fairly new in our world. And honestly, I find the title and the premise of this debate kind of insulting and demeaning, because I am bisexual and not just an LGBT rights supporter as claimed in my bio. Is my life and existence up for debate? Do we want to mimic Sharia? Is that what's going on? I was not consulted on the title, and I didn't know until the announcement was made to all of you. The loaded phrasing biases everyone involved and ensures that no self-respecting LGBTQ person would be here. And in fact, I almost gave it up. But I figured it would be better for me to have a platform than not, so I thank you for that. Imagine if somebody called a debate Christianity, bloodthirsty crusader cult, or religion. Would you go to that? Would you feel that it was fair? I don't think you would if you were on the Christian side. In any case, any anti-LGBT arguments hinge on singling out LGBT people and our lives and existence. Very few people fret very much about nature versus nurture with regards to other things. Why do we do so here? Is it nature or nurture for straight people to marry because they have fallen into romantic love? After all, love marriage is a very new concept in this world. It's much newer than same-sex relationships, love, and sex. It is almost unheard of to this day in many cultures and countries, the same ones that often permit LGBT people, by the way, to have a love marriage. I'm just gonna hold this. And yet no one is having a debate called love marriage, innate, or perversion. That's not happening. A related concept is male monogamy in marriage. Traditionally speaking, men had their pick of the litter. Polygyny was normal. In fact, it's in the Bible, multiple and many times. Whether legally sanctioned or not, men were not expected to be monogamous in their marriages. They had wives, mistresses, concubines, spoils of war. The lack of monogamy in men throughout history has been the norm. And yet, no one's talking about whether or not male monogamy in marriage is a perversion or innate. Why are we singled out? Why am I singled out for this? The answer goes back to a little joke that happened at the beginning of this debate, where Bruce mentioned his butt and David mentioned how uncomfortable he was to be looking at it. There is very good scientific evidence to show that the disgust response is very, very pronounced in conservatives. Conservatives tend to have a much bigger disgust reaction and a much stronger disgust reaction. And so when straight men feel disgust towards men with men, that manifests itself as homophobia. It is hatred and disgust, pure and simple. I wonder if the hatred is innate or a perversion. After all, it's humanity, right? We're human beings. Without community, how would we get along? Without helping each other, how would we exist? It's kind of a perversion to hate people. In fact, it might even be considered a perversion of the love that most religions, even Christianity with all its homophobia, claim to preach. For that matter, do Christians deserve any rights whatsoever based on their religion? Most of you who are Christian here would say you chose to be a Christian. No one forced you. You weren't born that way. In fact, you were born again. So why should I give you rights based on your religion and your choice? Why should you get things like tax breaks for your churches and other exemptions? Why do your clergy get to have free housing? Being a Christian, by this definition of perversion versus innate, is truly a perversion. The nature versus nurture debate is a very incredibly old one. And as David mentioned, it's a very complicated thing. You know, it's probably not going to be that someday we're going to find that there's one gene that makes you gay. The best we have right now is that it's a combination of both genetics and environment. Environment including prevailing culture. Genetics provide predispositions, and the environment provides factors that enable or switch on certain genetics. This is true of everything and anything, and not just sexual orientation or preference. As for the history of LGBT people, although the term homosexuality might be a neologism, under whatever name, people who have loved and had sex with and relationships with people of the same gender have existed throughout history, despite the best efforts of society to erase, eradicate, murder, and torture them out of existence. They managed to thrive and survive and even leave records behind anyway. So if we're going to talk about nature, that's something that's clearly repeated itself throughout the history of human beings. Now, I know many of you on the Christian side don't agree with evolution, but there is a species of ape that is very genetically close and related to us called the bonobo. This is a species that resolves conflict through sexual activity as opposed to violence. The sexual activity occurs between members of the troops regardless of their sex. This doesn't mean that I'm claiming that we should imitate all animal behaviors, because obviously a lot of them are pretty brutal and violent. But if we're talking about choice versus innate and so on, you know, there's some evidence there. The bottom line here is, again, the premise of this is incredibly ridiculous to me. We're not having debates on innate versus perversion, to use that word that almost made me back out of this. We don't do that with other things in society, things that cause harm. What about domestic violence? What about any number of other things? But we don't see churches hosting this kind of debate. So as much as we can posture and say this isn't about morality, this is about science, there clearly is some sort of disgust, hate, or moral angle to even putting on a debate like this.
So we've heard from opening from David Penrose, and then we heard a counter from Heina Dadabhoy, and now for 10 minutes, Madam Timer, we will have Dr. David Lehman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Everyone should be able to do what they want to do. This is a general premise, many times suggested by people from various backgrounds, and I would say this is probably true of most atheists. But we look at a little thing called history, 1983. They faced with an unknown 20,000 transfusion patients, surgery patients, hemophiliacs, new mothers with their babies would become infected with HIV. We know that 3,000 people who have died from gay blood because they wanted to give their blood. In the West Coast, major cities like San Francisco, they have stalls where they have blow buddies, where people have oral sex through a wall. They have bathhouses by the hundreds across the country, gay bars which have a back room where they're practicing homosexual practices. And 30,000 gays get HIV every year. I don't like to use the word gay because I think it doesn't really give the picture, but CDC tells us that each infection costs American people $700,000. Why should we have to pay for that? They can't be arrested because it's legal. 10,000 of times a night in public restrooms, homosexuals are having sex of some kind. This is, and so I have a question. And homosexuals account for half of the U.S. cases of syphilis, gonorrhea, hepatitis B. 65% of the U.S. AIDS cases, 87% in Minnesota, still occur in the homosexual men. AIDS in its early years in the U.S. was almost exclusively a male homosexual disease. Diseased homosexual and food handlers in public restaurants were responsible for major outbreaks of amoebiasis and hepatitis A infections in San Francisco and Minneapolis. There are 70,000 deaths per year from just amoebiasis. The cost to society is difficult to calculate, but annual medical costs for caring for AIDS patients alone is expected to increase. This is back from 1990 to 1993, from $5 billion to $10 billion. Homosexuals are 12 times more likely to molest children than heterosexuals. Homosexual teachers are 5 times more likely to make sexual advances and 7 times more likely to have sexual contact with their students than heterosexual counterparts. 90% reported having engaged in oral anal sexual activity, inserting the tongue into or licking the anus. That's 70% with regularity. Homosexuals report that 17% report eating and or rubbing themselves with feces of their partners. On the average, homosexual men ingest feces of 23 different men a year. 19% reported urinating or defecating on their partners. 20% report sadomasochism, where their partner is hurt, scratched, bruised, or bloodied. 41% report fisting, where their hand and arm are inserted in the rectum of their partner. They are 15 times more likely to commit murder than heterosexuals. Police assume gory murders to be homosexual until proven otherwise. 1 out of 10 homicides in San Francisco is due to sadomasochistic sex among homosexuals. Their cry is, "We shall sodomize," this is a quote from their magazine, "We shall sodomize your sons, emblems of your feeble masculinity, of your shallow dreams and vulgar lies. We shall seduce them in your schools, in your dormitories, in your seminaries, in your youth groups, in your movie theater bathrooms, in your army bunkhouses, in your truck stops, in your houses of Congress, wherever men are with men together. Your sons shall become our minions and do our bidding. They will be recast in our image. They will come to crave and adore us. All laws banning homosexuality will be revoked. Instead, legislation shall be passed which engenders love between men. If you dare cry faggot, fairy, queer at us, we will stab you in your cowardly hearts and defile your dead, puny bodies. We shall write poems of love between men. We shall stage plays in which man openly caresses man. We shall make films about love between heroic men, which will replace the cheap, superficial, sentimental, insipid, juvenile, heterosexual infatuations presently dominating your cinema screens. The family unit, sprawling ground of lies, betrayals, mediocrity, hypocrisy, and violence, will be abolished. The family unit, which only dampens imagination and curbs free will, must be eliminated. All churches who condemn us will be closed. Our only gods are handsome young men. This came from the Gay Community News, February 15th, 1987. It's somewhat dated. Why are the laws against sodomy vital and beneficial for all citizens, including sodomites? And I use that word because I think that's a biblical term. The first purpose of a law is to give instructions to those who violate universal standards, which bring destruction to themselves and those around them. Sodomy is a self-consuming passion which will not be satisfied, or will not satisfy those who engage it. Instead, it will produce enslavement to ever-increasing cravings for fulfillment. If no law exists to prohibit sodomy, or worse yet, if laws are made to protect it, thousands of unsuspecting citizens will be drawn into it without knowing of its dangers. Why is it impossible to contain sodomy once it's legalized? The true nature of sodomy is seen in the number of sexual partners the average homosexual has. Homosexual men commonly have 20 to 30 sexual contacts in a single night. The Kinsey Institute studies indicate that 50% of homosexual males have between 100 and 1,000 different, usually anonymous, sexual partners, while almost 30% of such homosexuals have had more than 1,000 sexual contacts. Monogamous relationships in the homosexual community are very rare and seldom last longer than 2 years. Because of this continual search for new contacts, especially ones that do not already have STDs, young boys and girls are often victims of the unrestrained sexual appetites of older sodomites. because 67% of those whose first sexual experience is with one of the same gender end up practicing sodomy as an adult. It spreads through society rapidly. Therefore, it is important to protect our children with all the legal power we can. Homosexuality is everybody's problem. Homosexuality costs society by creating massive health, personal, and social problems. It produces nothing of substantive value, yet we all must pay for this activity. The enormous liabilities of homosexuality are borne collectively merely to provide empty amusement for its practitioners. The white fight from Hammond has nothing to do with what compared to the flight from some cities that have identified or passed laws to protect it. How is sodomy defined by God's law? Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Defile not yourselves in any of these things, for it is the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you, and the land is defiled. Therefore do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth her out her inhabitants. This is what God has given us in the Scripture. But there is a movie out called Empty Cities. It was a moody science film, and in it depicted 22 civilizations. Each one of them had gone along until all of a sudden the government, or whatever, the king or whoever, allowed sodomy to reign, to rule, and they were destroyed. When the iniquity of the Amorites was full, God destroyed them. And there seems to be a pattern. We went through every single civilization, and it wasn't a gradual trend. It was something that happened almost instantly. So I believe that about 100 years ago, a lot of the historians started looking for secondary causes, but before that, almost every historian looked at this as moral decay that caused the destruction of these civilizations. And we might ask the question, aren't homosexuals entitled to the same civil rights as all Americans? Yes, homosexuals already have the same rights as other Americans, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, rights to petition the government, free exercise of religion, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures of all the other commonly held civil rights. What homosexuals want, though the proposed addition to human rights ordinance is to create a distinction in the law. If it creates a distinction in the law, then such distinction opens the door for requests for special privileges. Homosexuals, unlike minorities, do not warrant minority legal status, though a stated distinction in the law. Race, national origin, gender are innate, immutable, and do not necessarily affect one's lifestyle or moral behavior. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was an African-American acquainted with the discrimination, pointed out on May 25, 1992 in Army Times that skin color is benign, non-behavioral characteristic. Sexual orientation is perhaps the most profound human behavioral characteristic. Comparison of the two is convenient but an invalid argument. Homosexual is not an inborn trait. Many homosexuals change their behavior. If homosexual were innate, change would be impossible. One can become a former homosexual, but one cannot become a former African American or former Hispanic American. I'm done.
Before we go into question and answer, we're going to allow some time for a conversation, or I know some people commonly call it a rebuttal for what you've just heard. So we'll give you, Madam Timer, 2 to 3 minutes on these, and then the other guys can respond. Thank you.
Yeah, because I thought they were going to go first, and then I was going to go, well, where do I start with all of this? Where do I even begin? Let's start with the idea that there's such a thing as a former homosexual. The idea that somebody can be converted from gay to straight, or vice versa for that matter, since there seems to be a lot of fear about conversion of straight people to being gay, that's false. All the institutes that claim to do conversion therapy, for the most part, have been disbanded and discredited. In the case of one of the most famous ones, I believe it was called Exodus, the 2 founders of it ended up marrying each other, because that's what happens. As for the idea of special rights, we all know that we all have the same rights. However, we all know that those rights are enforced unevenly. So asking for the rights to be enforced more evenly is not asking for special rights. As for the molestation rates, citations sorely needed. Citations sorely needed. When I was once a homophobe as well, I scoured the research looking for any evidence that anyone who is not straight is more likely to molest, and that's simply not true. The same goes for the murder statistics. I'm not sure where those come from. And I could have taken the cheap tactic of finding some sort of scary shock quote from straight publications, because trust me, they do exist, whether y'all know it or not. I had never heard that gay quote before, despite the fact that just a few weeks ago I was at the National LGBT Task Force Conference. I heard nothing of conversion. I heard nothing of perverting boys and making them your minions. And I wasn't even born when that quote was written. And that might be a good thing, because I'm really glad that a certain generation who thinks a certain way is eventually going to be out of my life. As for kinks that were mentioned, 50 Shades of Grey is not a gay story. It is as straight as they come. It is as heterosexual as they come. It is a national phenomenon. People are flocking to this movie. People are imitating the behavior. So we queers do not have the monopoly on weird sex. You all are doing it too. Just thought that should get out there. As for the adverse effects that can happen with, being associated with being gay, you find these problems with any oppressed population. Any population where you have to be secretive, where you have to hide who and what you are, it's very common for you to suffer all kinds of adverse effects. As for the STI rates, I'm not sure how old the ones that were cited were, but part of the issue is that a lot of straight women simply do not get tested for STIs, and a lot of straight men too. They simply do not think that they can get something. Whereas most gay men are fully aware that they are at risk for HIV, and so they get more tested. And that biases the results of how much gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia is found among gay men. And hey, why should I have to pay for the pregnancy of Christians who can't seem to stop having babies? It's a slippery slope when you're talking about who pays for what for medical care. As for anal sex and these sodomite behaviors, as the gentlemen over there called them, they are in rapid increase among young teenage couples, straight ones, not same-sex couples. And if you want to talk about who has the least anal sex, since that seems to be a fixation over here, it's lesbians. You know who has the lowest STI transmission rate? Lesbians. Who has the lowest unwanted pregnancy rate? Lesbians. Who has the best outcome for children, even better than those of male-female parents? Lesbians. So if God loves anyone, I'd say it's the lesbians. But they're sodomites and they're all going to get AIDS and die, I suppose. In any case, the bottom line is that a lot of these statistics seem out of date. I wasn't aware that this was going to be this kind of debate. Otherwise, I would have brought even more fiery swords with me. But yeah, I really feel like I have been misled on several counts with this debate. And I just wanted to put that out there. So, my poor performance might also be a little bit attributed to the fact that Christians seem to enjoy deceiving me when it comes to my own identity.
If I could just respond briefly to that. The rantings of mad people, emotionally charged comments by either side, by both sides, is not an academic practice. It is not the practice of scholars. If you want to make an assertion, base that assertion upon an unbiased, juried source. I hear one person making the demand for a citation, yet I don't recall hearing in all of the rambling one study that was cited by author, year, and upon request, the bibliographic data. What was the title of the study? No. But please, afford me the same privilege that I have to sit here and listen to vast emotional rantings on either side. Gentlemen, we've come together to reason together. I prepared for this dialogue using exclusive secular scholarly data, publications, and which I'm happy to provide to each of you if you're interested. I haven't used one single religious source.
I have a lot of things I would like to share, but probably would be to understand the gay rights agenda. What is it? In an article, I'm quoting, "The Overhauling of Straight America," Marshall Kirk and Erastus Pill state the methods the gay activists have as follows. Talk about gays and gayness as loudly and often as possible. The principle behind this advice is simple. Almost any behavior begins to look normal if you expose enough of it at close quarters and among your acquaintances. Portray gays as victims, not as aggressive challengers. In any campaign to win the public, gays must be cast as victims and need protection, so that the straights will assume the role of protector. Give protectors a just cause. It should not demand support for homosexual practices, but should take an anti-discrimination as its theme, the right to be free, free speech, freedom for beliefs, freedom of association, due process, and equal protection of the laws. Make gays look good. The campaign should paint gays as superior pillars of society, point out men such as Socrates, Shakespeare, Alexander the Great, Michelangelo, Walt Whitman. Make the victimizers look bad. First, seek to replace the mainstream's pride about homophobia with shame and guilt. Second, make anti-gays look so bad the average Americans will disassociate themselves from them. These images might include Ku Klux Klan members. It might demanding gays be burned alive or castrated, bigoted Southern ministers drooling with historical hatred, menacing punks, thugs, and convicts speaking of coolly about fags they've killed or would like to kill. So this is the idea. This is their mentality. This is how they probably would want us to, and this is what they've been doing systematically throughout this country.
Yes. Directing this towards Dave Lehman. I believe you said that one cannot become a former African American. Might I cite Michael Jackson? Thank you.
Funny.
It was cute. I'm not sure it was definitive.
It's going to be a slow night if I'm coming up now. I usually. Okay, this might be it. We might have an early debate. Heina, I need to know, man, oh man, is that God speaking or what? There's an echo happening here. I'm going to have to adjust that.
You'll know when God speaks.
Can you please, whoa!
Hello.
There we go. I know that there's some type of gay agenda, but I think it follows a civil rights agenda. Can you explain a little bit more about your perception of the gay agenda, if there is one?
There is a gay agenda. It's written on pink paper with sparkly gel pen. No. Thank you. Yes, a little levity. Yeah, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I had the honor and the privilege to not only attend the National LGBTQ Task Force conference called Creating Change, I also had the distinct pleasure of meeting with the organizers because, believe it or not, there were way more Christian workshops than secular ones, and I was advocating for more secular ones, so some of you might be surprised to hear that. But in any case, the gay agenda that was discussed there was ending the murder of trans women. Because in Denver, where the conference was held earlier that week, an unarmed trans woman was murdered by a cop. And so that was one of the issues that came up. Another issue that came up was problems within our LGBT community, intersectional problems with racism or sexism or things like that. Taking care of LGBTQ elders, because a lot of them were disowned from their families and never had the chance to have a spouse and a child. And so there are a lot of elders who are LGBTQ and really need help. And so that is one of the issues that came up as well. So there wasn't any talk about turning young men into gods or anything like that. There was a lot of really good, productive discussion. And their reports are easily available. The National LGBT Task Force makes everything available. And I encourage all of you, even if you are opposed to LGBT rights, to have a look and to really verify with your own eyes what the modern LGBT movement looks like.
Any response from Dave or Dave? Okay.
Hi. Sorry to come up twice.
No, you're not.
This would be for the Christian side. Assuming that we have no control over what tastes good to us, such as myself, I've hated baked beans my entire life. I still hate them now. People have tried to convert me. They've tried to persuade me. They've had me taste the beans. I do not like baked beans. They're horrible.
You're a bean hater.
I am a bean hater.
You're
I
a
admit that.
bonophobe. Beanophobe.
I'm a beanophobe. Now, given that, I'm curious intellectually, is the Christian objection to homosexual sex, or is the Christian objection to the desire that some people have for those of the same sex?
I'd love to answer that question. My objection to the discussion, the assertion of homosexuality as we're talking about same-sex interaction, same-sex behavior, being anything other than a behavior, something that we choose to engage in. That's offensive to me, and it's not based on science. One of the reasons that I really wanted to be a part of the debate tonight is because I thought this was going to be a purely scientific, good science debate. Let's take a look at what science has shown us regarding what we know about behavior, orientation, call those mannerisms, actions. All of those things are influenced by a multitude of variables. And I am not willing to accept that there's any one reason for that. But I'm also not willing to concede that it's probably more a matter of choice and more a matter of orientation and more a matter of preference. So the problem is there's emotion behind the debate which interferes with us having a rational conversation. We're not talking about human dignity and the respect for all people, regardless of how they want to dress. For example, if a person is homosexual by nature or cross-dressing is an aberrant sexual behavior, then I'm guilty because in the theater, I was required to play female roles. During the time of Shakespeare, there were no female actors. So just because a person puts on female garments, does that mean that that person is an aberrant? No. So my response to that is simple. It's fluid, but the discussion still has to come back to don't assert that science does not support that it is something that science cannot support.
Well, good question. I have recently discovered that there are people that have certain desires, and one of them is to make bestiality legal, and it has been legal in Denmark. In fact, they have dog brothels, and these animals are chained to a table. Their arms are broken, tied behind their back, and with their mouths taped shut. Then they are raped repeatedly. Most dogs and cats die from internal bleeding. This is rape. It's disgusting. But this is happening in Denmark. Bestiality is spreading throughout Germany. The animal might get paralyzed from being overstretched. Uncomfortable death of animal resulting from positioning unnaturally and in a manner posed to cause injury. This zoophilia, pornography, gives the wrong idea about bestiality. It's the numerous zoonuses. These are things that you can get as a result of this kind of behavior from an animal during sexual intercourse. Some of these diseases include, but are not limited to, rabies, tapeworms, cholera, cowpox, and anthrax disease. And this is one of the things that people apparently like.
The question was, is the desire per se evil, sinful, wrong, morally reprehensible? The desire, not the action, not the carrying it out. Just if one man looks at another man and gets a boner, is he going to go to hell?
With no sex, we're talking about.
No sex.
I think you are terribly mistaken if you think that the answer to that can be summed up in a matter of seconds. If you want to talk about the science behind how human beings respond affectionately to other human beings, there's sound science for that. To the extent that that behavior becomes manifested in a way that is novel or not routine, that's also science. But to ask somebody the emotionally charged question, we're supposed to be scholars talking good science about a topic which is very emotionally charged, and yet I wouldn't necessarily say it's scientifically conclusive, but the science that is reaffirmed fails to support those studies that make novel claims. Simon LeVay, one of those very studies.
I might add to that, it was something like 97% of those that have those desires end up carrying them out. And I could find that if you want.
On my tiptoes. Sexual orientation is a term that we've put into the law in the last century, I guess, and I've always understood it to be a choice. And then they came out with I was born that way. And a lot of the young people, we're talking middle schoolers, are finding themselves being taught, I was born that way. And what I want to know is, what does the science really say about that concept?
Well, first of all, don't blame the queers for that one. Lady Gaga is not gay. She's straight. So Born That Way's popularity is her fault. It's straight fault. Yeah, the science, which I'm sure you have a lot of, it's a lot of it is very varied. You know, they'll point to one thing. They'll say, oh, if you're the fifth son, then you're more likely to be gay. Or, oh, if you have this gene. Or, oh, if your ring finger's this size. Or, oh, testosterone. And none of this has been terribly conclusive. And I actually am not on the side that I think that anyone is born any particular way when it comes to something as complex as one's romantic and sexual desires in one's life. So I'm not in disagreement there. I don't think that there's, you're born and that's just how you're necessarily going to be.
Simon LeVay conducted a study of looking at the brain structure of homosexuals and heterosexual males. One of the largest studies ever conducted is in Australia, some 9,000 subjects. Now that's a pretty significant and compelling sample size. But they asserted, based on this published study, that the hypothalamus was markedly similar among homosexuals and different from heterosexuals. That's the assertion. But let me give you a quote from Simon LeVay, the author of that study. He offers this clarification. It's important to stress what I didn't find. I did not prove that homosexuality was genetic, or find a genetic cause for being gay. I didn't show that gay men were born that way. The most common mistake people make in interpreting my work, Niemann's 1994. His original study was published in 1991, by the way. So, and I appreciate the fact that you're willing to concede to what science does say, which is even those who have conducted the most compelling, largest sample size study, which has been misinterpreted and misrepresented, have come out with clarification to say equivocally that their study did not prove what people asserted that it proved.
All right. I'd like to make just two quick points. One is I just returned to the United States after 12 years in the Far East, and one of the things that happened while I was over there was that I was constantly bombarded by questions from people living, in Asians in the Far East, about life in America. And a lot of times the ideas they had about how we lived here didn't match at all the lifestyle that we live here. They were typically stereotypical ideas about that. It's common all around the world. We have different ideas about how people live elsewhere. And the arguments that I'm hearing now, I went to college in a school that was a very liberal school, and I had a lot of experiences in that community, in the gay community, and a lot of the arguments that I'm hearing remind me of the questions I would receive from Japan and the observations I would receive from other parts of Asia about what it was like in America. It was a foreign view of a landscape that didn't really match what I had seen. So, of course, anecdotal evidence isn't much, but I just wanted to point that out. It's an interesting perspective. The second point is that I was reading an article last week about a young woman. She's one of the finalists that's on the Mars One mission. So she was talking in the article about maybe going to Mars or maybe remaining on Earth. And she was talking about the different paths that she could go on. And I was struck by the point that she made that in either path, she hoped that she might find a husband or a wife. And it struck me that to her, the idea that it was inherently one or the other was removed. It was more a matter of choice than of bias in the body. So my question for you guys is, what if we remove the need to justify or provide some reason to be gay and just simply allow it to be a choice? How does that change the parameters?
Could I add the result of some recent studies that have been done? There have been some studies. You could find this article on gizmag.com, but it's also published out of a journal called Cell magazine. SOX17 was actually a genetic marker which has been used to propose the possibility that organs could be created in a laboratory environment. For example, typically, if you're familiar with the stem cell research, it was using stem cells to recreate in the lab organs that could be used for transplanting, for example, for an only child when the parents would normally have had another child, and maybe there would be a match, maybe there wouldn't. This particular study is showing that the information can be gathered from a skin cell used to create both an egg and a sperm cell in a laboratory, so that two individuals who want to create, and we all know about artificial insemination, but if we can create a liver, scientifically we're at the point where it's possible to get the DNA marker so that that created human being would be a direct reflection of those two individuals. So it's not, we are likely to scientifically be able to see a time, like you say, that it's two people who have a bond with one another, that it's capable of doing that. Now again, I personally did not come here to talk about the emotional reasons for doing that or not doing that, only to talk about scientifically what's possible and what are we finding conclusively and not finding, and what we can't support. Because you know what? That's one of the biggest reasons that these two groups love getting together, I would think. So I hope that answered your question.
And just to address it really quick, my opening statement really was about that, essentially that even if it's a choice, it's not necessarily something that needs to be considered bad, because there are a lot of things that are not innate that we accept in society, and I believe that falls under that.
By the way, if you want to see that, I do have the first page of that article that was published. By the way, that just came out January 15th. So.
Heina, this is for you. I hope I'm saying your name right.
Heina, yeah.
Heina. Okay. You guys were talking about the numbers behind like molestation and homosexuality. We know that like 95% of molesters are men, yet the mix between the children is about 50-50 or maybe like 60-40. So if 19 out of 20 of the molesters are male and almost half of the children are male, then that means that it's predominantly homosexual molestation and not heterosexual.
That's actually a really excellent question, and it really is a misreading of the data that's at the heart of this. A lot of men, and you're right, most sexual predators who prey on children are men, but yet no one's talking about whether or not men are perversion. Not even the most ardent feminist groups I go to say anything about that. But in any case, you're right. The balance of genders between molested children is pretty similar. It's not that girls are getting more molested than boys. What that comes down to is molestation is not some sort of overpowering lust that takes over somebody and they molest. It's a crime of opportunity. And so if a molester has a boy who they are grooming and able to have access to, they will molest a boy. And a lot of these molesters who have molested boys insist that they are heterosexual and that they have sex with women, and there is good evidence to show that that's what's going on. It's a crime of opportunity. Most of these men would not say they were gay. They've had sex with women their whole lives. They merely have an attraction to children. And pedophilia is a separate debate that probably could happen. But that seems to be the issue. It's not the gender of the child, it's the opportunity as well as the attraction of children. And frankly, the fact that children are vulnerable and that they have power in that situation. So it's same-sex molestation. To call it a product of a man being gay is not necessarily accurate, since a lot of these guys are married with children to women.
I have one more point to make regarding getting back to like scientific studies. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but I read about a study where they looked at identical twins where one was homosexual, and it came out to be like 90-something% of the other identical twin was not homosexual. So would that kind of eliminate the idea that it's genetic and be more of a nurture, not a nature?
Well, yes, right?
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with the fact that science fails to show that, that there's a genetic link to sexual preference and in the engagement of any type of situation. Right.
Well, first of all, not every single queer person says that we're born that way. I am here arguing the exact opposite. And in fact, if you Google "born this way," you will find innumerable critiques written by LGBT people about this "born this way" idea. So yeah, I wouldn't generalize just because Lady Gaga said something. Again, straight lady, she's your problem, not mine.
Hi, this is for Dave on the right. I was curious as to why in your discussion about homosexuality you brought up just a slew of sexual deviance as a whole, because a lot of those, as she said, is typical of heterosexual sexuality as well. And deviant, not in a judgmental way, but deviant as in outside the bell curve, and if we're judging something to be deviant outside the bell curve of society, that's really more like a cultural moray. But it was just, I was confused. Do you believe that homosexuality leads to, a perversion of other things as a whole? I'm not sure why you brought in, BDSM or fisting or anal play, because that's very popular amongst sexuality as a whole.
Can you define popular? I'm just curious. I want to know statistically how you're defining popular, and based upon whose other opinion are you making that assertion?
I'm sorry, about how popular
No,
that
you made
occur?
the statement based on a bell curve, and
right.
You said popular, and I'm not trying to respond for David Lehman, but I'm trying to keep us focused here. If you want to make an assertion that something is a norm or popular, I really do need to see somebody else's juried opinion besides just that dramatic claim.
What was my dramatic claim?
That it was normal for a lot of people.
No, I actually said it was outside the bell curve, outside of sexual norms. That's what I meant by deviant.
Oh, okay.
That's what I said. So
I didn't hear
deviant
that
as in outside the sexual norms, but within that context, that also describes it as being part of a cultural mores. Right. And I'm not saying, so there's just different things that people engage in within sexuality, but you just listed a whole bunch of those. Discussion of homosexuality. And I thought that there are two separate issues.
I'm not aware of any study that shows that heterosexual males are fisting or
They fist their wives.
I'm not aware of that.
There's a great podcast I listen to called Sex Nerds Laundry. She's a sex educator.
I was a prison psychologist, and I'll tell you, of 1,800 men living in the same location, there were a lot of things that in an open community where, men have access to women, that the behavior crosses a lot of boundaries. So again, I could easily say that that's a behavior that people engage in out of opportunity, not necessarily out of perversion or deviance. But
so I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I'm expressing my question correctly, but as a whole, when you paralleled also the fact that there was bestiality was legalized within Denmark, was it? Right, within Denmark, and you paralleled that along with, well, look at this. Like, if sexuality, then are you making the leap then to that people would want to engage within, bestiality? Are you connecting those things? Because I find that kind of insulting to, I'm straight, but I kind of find it insulting to them. And because I agree with you that that's rape. And most people I talk to is if they're going to condone sexual activity, it has to be two conscious and consenting adults. And that does not require that, obviously, bestiality. That would be rape. And I don't know of anyone on the LGBT community that I've ever met to and talked with that they would condone that activity or say, like, yeah, just because they want to, they should be able to go ahead and do it.
I was responding to Mark's question. He said, just because I like to do it, does that, and I understand he was going in a different direction, but basically the concept, just because you like to do something makes it acceptable. I'm saying that that's not acceptable, and I just gave that as an illustration.
Gotcha, thank you for that. So just as a thought that there are lots of things that occur within the heterosexual community and not it's all stemming from homosexual behavior. My thought.
Next.
Hello. I guess I'll have to stand on my tiptoes.
Move the mic or take it off if you like.
Or just grow taller.
I've tried for years. Doesn't work. Just wear 3-inch heels. I have a question for all of you.
Hold the mic up to your mouth so I can hear.
Have you heard or read any studies on homosexuals becoming that way because of hormones or environment? I'm asking that question because my younger sister is a lesbian, and I saw her grow up, and I have an older sister. I'm the middle. I don't have any brothers, but my older sister and I, at Christmas time, we'd ask for, baby dolls and carriages and all that, where my younger sister, when she was 5 years old, she would ask for, like, holsters and guns and cowboy hats. However, when my mother was pregnant with her, she was ill. So I'm thinking there might be a hormonal imbalance there. And then one more thing. And then when she was born, when she was about 1 or 2 years old, in between there, my mother got sick again. And so we had to go with relatives, but my younger sister, she was almost 2, she stayed with my dad. So I'm thinking that she identified with my father and didn't have that much connection with my mom.
I have just a really, really brief response to that
Okay.
I think you'll be very, very satisfied with. My recommendation to you is one of the leading authorities on female sexual behaviors, Dr. Linda Diamond. Linda H. Diamond. My recommendation to you, because she talks and has done research in what she calls gender fluidity. It's specifically looking at sexual preference behavior among women. It's not dealing with men sexual preference. The other, in my humble opinion, leading authority on this subject is Luann Brizendine, who's a neuropsychiatrist who wrote a book called The Female Brain. All of that read is very enlightening. And she takes it, both of these authors impress me as scholars for taking a very comprehensive and open look at the phenomena of the influences on environment, on genetics, on hormones, in terms of the kind of social environment that they're exposed to, biases of religion. So my suggestion is to you, don't take any one person's opinion. Find the authorities in the field who are doing the research and read for yourself. I could certainly summarize those for you, but I think it would be more meaningful for you to share that and share those resources with your sister. That's my suggestion.
All right, thank you.
My response would be that, we human beings, we survive by pattern recognition, right? We look for a sign, we look for causation. That causation isn't always necessarily there. People have theorized a lot that, it's, being abused as a child or, relating to your mother or your father, things like that. I can tell you as a woman who loves women, I don't think of myself as a man. I am a woman who loves women. I don't think I'm my dad and I'm going to be with a lady because of that. It's not, I think a lot of straight people do have this tendency to try to say who's the man in the relationship. The girl I'm dating and I are both very feminine. So, none of us is the man, we're both the girl. That's how gayness works. I wouldn't necessarily say that those factors have anything to do with it. My sister was the tomboy and she's as straight can come. I was the girly girl and I'm the one who turned out, sodomite, I guess, whatever you want to call it. I would say that we tend to look for these patterns, but they're not necessarily there. That's what I would say about that.
Well, I also think that part of it was hormonal because when she was in her mid-20s, a doctor put her on birth control pills, and she became straight. She got married. I mean, this is really strange. And so she got married, and she was married for 5 years, and then she went off the pill, and then she went back to being a lesbian.
Well, then I would say she's bisexual. She's not a lesbian or straight.
No, she doesn't. No, she has no interest in men ever since she
went
off the pill.
As a general survey of her life.
I think research is showing that preferences and how we express affection and sexual interest is a very fluid experience. I don't know, because I have not seen a single reputable researcher write on the subject that said a female is born with a preference for female sexual encounters, or that a female who at some stage in her life prefers female sexual encounters is that way throughout their entire life. That's why the Linda Diamond Authority, and she describes herself as a very clear lesbian. So here's somebody that I trust who's simply saying, I'm willing to recognize my bias, but try not to let that bias influence what I find through research. So, again.
Next question.
Oh, sorry.
Hi. Well, what you said about everybody having rights and them not being enforced, or what was it that you said?
Unequally enforced.
I'm totally with you there, because as a Christian, I feel like we're persecuted a lot. In fact, we're an endangered species in a number of countries around the globe. And like at Christmas time, we can't even say Merry Christmas. And we're not like pushing our agenda. We're just greeting somebody. And I could say Happy Kwanzaa or, Happy Hanukkah. But so I'm glad you stayed, because I don't want you to go away feeling angry. But I do have a question for you. When you say the word queers, to me that has a really bad connotation. And, people used to be, before homosexuality became, more out of the closet, people that were queer were not people that you really, it wasn't a sexual preference. And it's like calling them Japs and niggers. And I thought, do you guys really call yourself queers?
There's a term among social justice circles and communities called taking it back. Queer has been one of those words that has been reappropriated for our own uses. You can go to universities and get a degree in queer studies. It's an umbrella term that encompasses lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, to some degree asexuals, people who consider themselves to have no sexual attractions. It's considered to be an umbrella term, but I do understand that there is a certain generation that feels very uncomfortable with the word. In fact, some older LGBT folks hate it when we younger ones use it. We whippersnappers with our dirty mouths. But to go back to talk about Christianity, you live in one of the most Christian nations in the world. You can say Merry Christmas if you want. No one's going to kill you. You're fine. I promise you. This December, run around saying Merry Christmas. Maybe someone will look at you funny, but that's not persecution.
But you could get fired for it because we're
a girl got fired for wearing a headscarf to work, but you're not here talking about how Muslims are persecuted. So it's a matter of perception, I think. There are a lot of things I want to do at work that I can't do, but I'd get fired for it. Talking about religion is considered to be sort of a faux pas at work.
And I'm glad that we have a sexual harassment and discrimination attorney in the room as well. It's an authority.
That wraps up our question and answer session, unless we have one more. I see a gentleman approaching the microphone. Okay, go right ahead. And you have 30 seconds, and we'll need to have this done in a minute and a half.
Yikes.
I'll stay right here.
One thing about the churches, as you well know, the churches are, young people are exiting churches in groves, mostly because of this anti-gay feeling that they're getting. And I wanted to know your opinion on that, being you're part of a church, but you're not a minister of a church, right, Dave Penrose? Is that correct?
That's correct, but I have a background in practical theology.
And to follow that up, when the Christians say they hate the sin, they love the sinner, when they say they love somebody, but that person that they're loving feels hate, is it more hate because the person who is feeling it gets the feeling that these people that say, I love you, but I'm not going to let you marry, or I'm not going to let you have all of these other rights that I have? How do you feel about that when Christians say, it's one of my pet peeves when I say, I love you, but you're going to hell. That's the same thing that I get as an atheist. I love you, and I go, well, I love you as an individual. I love you as a Homo sapien.
I don't know, Bruce, did you read the article that they published in the OC Register,
yes.
The comment that I had made?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't remember it.
Well, then you would understand that my comment is this. Every single person lives their life in a process of self-discovery and self-expression. What I choose to do today could be totally different than what I choose to do tomorrow. My only problem with the issue when we're talking about the rigidity and fixedness of homosexuality is the assertion that it's a predetermined state. I think that there is agreement that that's not the case. So since that's not the case, there's no reason to make it an issue in human interactions. There's no reason for me to step into a room and say, I assert my right to be what God created me to be, and that is homosexual or a serial killer. All of those things were choices that the person engaged in. To me, what I see happening in the church is a return to supporting one another as they learn to have a personal, religious, spiritual experience without condemnation and without judgment.
Do you feel, though, that the church is having people, especially younger people, not come to their churches for this very reason? Do you feel that that's true?
Do I think we live in a society that's an incredibly judgmental, whether it's church, school, or any other filial organization like the Boy Scouts? Absolutely. I think as a species, when we can begin to talk about how can you be the best person that you can be, without your asserting that because you choose to act in a certain way, and that's a behavior, that you deserve a platform to promote that behavioral agenda. I have a serious problem with that. I hope we all have serious problems with that. Whether you think that it's happening exclusively in the church, I would say it probably happens in a lot of religious organizations, not just the Christian church. There may be, and of course you could attest to Islam. There are certain behaviors which are considered aberrant to the point of
probably
even
much
being
more than in
killed.
America. That's how. That's
But the point is, you asked if the reason that people are not attending church is because
younger people.
Young people specifically. I would say to you, it's probably not anything exclusive to sexual orientation as much as it is an atmosphere of acceptance and support and trying to encourage that person to successfully be the best that they can be.
And
I don't see that happening in a lot of churches. So that's not exclusive to sexual choices.
So there's other reasons why they're not coming to church?
Absolutely.
Okay. A couple, I'm just going to have a little conversation here, if you don't mind. We have enough time? Do we have closing statements here? You have closing statements here?
I do.
Okay, very good. That'll be it then. I'll follow up later.
Thank you. I apologize for having to use your microphone.
Della, can we have a short break?
Yes, we're going to have a short break and then we'll have closing statements. 5 minutes. We do have restrooms. They are right here to your right. There are cookies, brownies. I think I saw red velvet cake, coffee. Have some refreshments and come back. 5 minutes. Madam Timer, 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Sorry.
Welcome back, everyone. Testing, testing. Again, this is debate number 15 for between the Christian Century Toastmasters Club and the Backyard Skeptics. And now, after that wonderful break, did you enjoy your refreshments? Everybody get coffee and water? Okay, perfect. All righty.
Did they pass around?
So what we want to do now is go into the closing statements. We had planned on having 10 minutes each. 10 minutes each, and we will be strict on that time, okay? All right, so we'll start off again with David Penrose. You'll have the opening, and I'll let it just roll. You're next, Heina Dadabhoy, and then David Lehman last. Start the time.
All right, thank you. Secular authorities. These are not fundamentalist Christians have made the following assertions. People can change their sexual orientation from homosexual to heterosexual. Spitzer, 2003. One's sexual preference or orientation with whom we want to be sexual depends on the gender identity of our sexual partner. Nagoshi and Bruzi, 2000. We will see, this is a quote, we will see later that the falsity of activists' repeated assertions that homosexuality is immutable. They seek to create the impression that science has settled these questions, but it most certainly has not. Instead, the changes that have occurred in both public and professional opinion have resulted from politics, pressure, and public relations. And you'll find that on page 38 in Satin over 1996. That there was an insufficient number of non-heterosexual participants to guarantee a high degree of statistical power in the genetic and environmental analysis. And this I threw in for Bruce. This is Bailey, 2000. This was regarding the twin studies that said that birth order, Bailey was the birth order study. Finally, homosexuality is not purely genetic. Environmental factors play a role. There is not a single master gene that makes people gay. I don't think we will ever predict who will be gay. That comes from Hammer and Copeland, 1994. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I actually agree with much of what was stated by David over here. This David, not the other one. And, you know, as I stated in my opening, when it comes to the idea of something being immutable or fixed, you know, most things aren't. We know that. We know that, you know, people fall in love and out of love. People want to do one job their whole lives and do another. I'm a case study in this. Thought I was born to be a teacher, and now I'm in web development of all things. Things obviously change. The way we express ourselves change. The way we think of ourselves certainly changes. That doesn't mean that we don't have any sort of proclivity or inclination towards certain things rather than others. The best example I can think of is, you know, people who say that they were born to be computer programmers. If you ever meet a computer programmer, most of them claim that's how they think, that's how they live and breathe. They eat code for dinner. And yet that job didn't exist not that long ago. And 50 years ago, any man that wanted to be a computer programmer couldn't be because it was considered a clerical woman's job. And I bring this up because we do, as human beings, like to have a sense of who we are, right? It's nice to know who you are and what you are and where you're going. But of course that shifts and changes over time. The fact that we single out sexual orientation to be scrutinized in this way and to say, well, if it's not innate, it can be changed, well, then why don't you choose to not be gay? It speaks to a deep-seated cultural disgust and homophobia more than anything. Because again, there are lots of things about our society that have changed. There are a lot of things that rely on environmental factors and aren't purely determined to be genetic. So even though I will agree and say, yes, it's not immutable, it's obviously and very clearly not fixed, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can go up to every person in a same-sex relationship and say, now change. That's not how love works. Most people understand that. As for the question of human dignity and human rights, I repeat, rights are not enforced evenly. And that's what the homosexual agenda, as I understand it, as somebody who just came from a conference that essentially sets the LGBT agenda for the year, I will say that that changes too. Additionally, I would really challenge anybody who claims that, you know, LGBT people are, you know, worse in some way than straight people. I challenge them to really look at the data on what happens when you oppress a class of people. Very few people here would say that someone who is not white is innately more criminal than the other, unless you're more racist than I thought you were, in which case, you have to listen to this part. But there are statistics that show that, you know, people within oppressed groups do tend to have more adverse effects. They do tend to commit more crimes and things like that. But we have to look at it from a holistic perspective and not just say, oh, well, clearly being gay causes more STIs or being a person of color causes more crime. Instead, we have to look at the society that we live in, and we have to look at what outcomes come out of oppression, what outcomes come out of repression, what outcomes come out of hatred and bigotry. And while the other David may call it a mentality, the idea that LGBTQ people are oppressed, I would counter with any number of statistics on the hate crimes, the prejudice, and the oppression that LGBTQ people face. I didn't even realize that the attractions that I was having were anything outside the norm until someone told me that they were. That affected me adversely, and I went through, you know, I had adverse reactions, but thankfully I was in a position in life where I could deal with them and handle them well. Not everyone is in that position. So again, I will say, whether or not it's innate or a choice or both or neither, or something that we don't understand yet as human beings, because science still has a long way to go with matters of the human mind and perhaps even heart, to speak metaphorically. I will say that I shouldn't have to argue that I was born a certain way to say that I am deserving of full human rights and recognition. Thank you.
I agree. You shouldn't have to. However, there is biblical injunctions against what you are describing. The Bible calls it sodomy, abomination, vile affections, burning with lust, dishonoring the body, lusting for strange flesh, filthy dreamers, abusers of themselves, defilers of themselves, violating nature, unseemly, shameful lusts, effeminate, wickedness, and reprobate. Those are biblical terms. Each one of them is described in Scripture as being something that was, at least God did not design us that way. And there are consequences for violating God's laws. Our Constitution was written primarily based upon the idea that we were a republic, which is based on law. And therefore we have certain laws that we as a people submit to, most of them based on what I believe was the Old Testament Scripture, New Testament. And when we violate certain laws, our ways are not his ways, neither are our thoughts his thoughts, for as heaven is higher than earth, so are his ways than our ways, and his thoughts than our thoughts. Sometimes we as humans have a tremendous ability to think logically to the wrong conclusion. And so we have to go back and look at the one who created us, and what did he say about things. And from a Christian perspective, I believe that God has given us his word to help us, to direct us, to give us wisdom, to understand that there are consequences. And these consequences, what I described in the first opening 10 minutes, these are real. These statistics are actual, very real, page after page of statistics taken from different sources. One of the first sources that did it was Kinsey. Kinsey was a professor there at the University of Indiana, and this is where I came from. And he was a biology professor. He really was studying the gall wasp. He was trying to prove evolution based upon his studies of the gall wasp. And then a course opened up with the idea of human sexuality, and he jumped on that and was allowed to teach it. So he started doing his research. But he did his research. Most of it was fraudulent. And to show that, he ended up coming up with 10% of the people were gay. Well, if that's true, that had a tremendous political impact because only 12% of the population were black. About 1% were Jewish. I mean, that was a tremendous voting bloc, and so the politicians were scared. If 10% are gay, then we better go along with whatever they were demanding. But Kinsey's method for soliciting information was designed to wring confessions out of the reluctant interviewees. In many instances, it may have led to false data. According to the co-author and biography Wardell Pomeroy, when Kinsey questioned prisoners, and they constituted a significant percentage of his sample, he offered them soft drinks, candy, and tobacco. At that time, bottled soft drinks were not permitted in Indiana prisons. When prisoners refused to admit to certain behaviors, Kinsey would throw up his hands in disgust and tell them that if they persisted in lying, he would terminate their interview and send them back to their cells. According to Pomeroy, they usually told Kinsey what they wanted to hear. Pomeroy fails to note any connection, of course, Kinsey's threat, but the fact is, recalcitrant interviews ended up admitting to sexual behavior in question. A false admission of sexual deviancy is a small price to pay for a few hours away from their cells and free cold drinks, snacks, and cigarettes. And so we have about 1 to 2%. All the studies that I have read, that male homosexuality is around between 1 and 2%, females about 0.8%, something like that. And I just talked to my brother, who's a full-time biblical counselor, and he came up with that same figure just recently. So what we do see, though, is the statistics far outweigh the percentage in the society. And so we look at child molestation, for example, and we see that 91% molesters of non-related children in Canada's Kingston Sexual Behavior Clinic from 1978 to 1984, 42% engaged in homosexuality. Of the 52 child molesters in Ottawa from 1983 to 1985, 60% were homosexual. But consider the percentage. I mean, so the 1970, the Kinsey Institute reported and of course this is just their testimonies, 565 white gays in San Francisco, 25% of them admitted to having sex with boys aged 16 or younger while they themselves were at least 21. In France, 129 convicted gays, average age 34 years, said they had sexual contact with a total of 11,007 boys, an average of 85 different boys per man. And this reported similarly that men who molested girls outside the family had average of 20 victims each. Those who molested boys averaged 150 victims each. So, I mean, the facts are statistically there for understanding this pattern of behavior will permeate an entire society. Reparative therapy for male homosexuality, Joseph Nicolosi, who lives not too far from here, did an excellent study showing where and why homosexuality is acquired. And it's not something that is innate, not born with. And so therefore you shouldn't get special rights for homosexuals. But I look at something as even more important, and that is understanding what we're dealing with here is a form of behavior that is a stronghold, and a biblical concept is a lie. And we have a lot of things. It doesn't become a stronghold until I believe that lie. And that we are supposed to cast down strongholds, every stronghold. And these people, as they accept it, we treat the person different than we do the sin itself, the stronghold that's binding them. And Christians in general are the ones reaching out to the gays. We're the ones that go out and try to help them to get them free from that bondage, which will destroy them. Only 1% live over the age of 65. And most of them die quite young, partially because of the tremendous number of diseases they have, not just AIDS, but so many other diseases that contact because of the particular kind of behavior. And most of them, I believe, or a good percentage of them anyway, want to be free, and we have the answer for that. So there's a difference between the bondage that they're experiencing. We can hate the sin and love the sinner, but one of the problems is that people say that they are gay. Then it becomes more difficult to separate the person from the actual what's binding them. This also would probably result in somebody that says they're an atheist. I mean, we can love the atheist, but when they claim identity with that particular idea, and I would consider that a lie, that it's difficult to separate the person from the actual bondage that they happen to be in. So I think you have to realize Christians are not hating the person. The fact is just the opposite. They're the only ones that seem to be reaching out to these people, trying to help them. It's not in a malicious way. It's, for the most part, it's out of love. And that's what we as Christians try to do. My brother was led to the Lord by Bob. Bob was a homosexual. My brother is one of the best pastors I know. He preaches really good sermons. But he wanted to help his friend Bob. And so he majored in psychology in college. And it was behavioral psychology. After he graduated, he found that, well, that's not going to help Bob. You've seen the movie, What About Bob? Well, that's kind of an idea. And he decided, well, maybe I should go to seminary. So I suggested he go to Grace Theological Seminary, which is where I went. So he went through and graduated from the seminary, and he said, that's not going to help Bob either. So then Larry Crabb started teaching at Grace Seminary biblical counseling. And he went through that 2-year program, got his master's in biblical counseling. And he said, now I found out what's going to happen, how I can help Bob. Of course, at this point, nobody knew where Bob was. But he realized that this was the answer. Somebody really needed to understand human behavior a little bit and apply biblical principles and try to help his friend. And I believe this is true of all of us as Christians. We want to help these people. We love them. And I would say the same with Heina. You know, we love her. We want to help her in any way we can. But we think that the best way to help somebody is to free them from the bondage that they're in.
Thank you very much. You've heard from Heina Dadabhoy, David Penrose, and Dr. David Lehman. The exhortation, of course, is for you. Is it deception? Is there disbelief? Is it perversion? Is it gender identity? Is it a matter of rights? The challenge to you is to know why you believe what you believe. And with that, I will turn it over to Bruce from Backyard Skeptics. Thank you very much.
Let's have a hand for our moderator. Wow, this was a doozy tonight. I was surprised. Actually, I think I'm going to have Dave and Dave debate themselves next time. They came across from two different viewpoints entirely, so that might be a worthwhile debate. Heina, I'm crying for Heina right now. Sorry, Heina. Wow. Okay. Well, like I say to my skeptic friends over here, if you want to know the truth, you always look at both sides. So take what everybody said here and discover it for yourself. And remember, it's always best to go to a neutral party to find out the truth. Most of the time, one side might be edging a little bit more to their persuasion. So we're going to be meeting up at Norm's for further discussion. I just wanted to have a count because I'm going there too. How many people might be going with me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, whoever gets there first, reserve a back table, right? That's the deal. Okay, everybody, say goodbye to the streaming audience. Goodbye, streaming audience. I'll see you here next month. We'll announce what topic it is.